Welcome to the 115th Europe Calling edition. I'm Maximilian Fries. I'm the Managing Director of Europe Calling, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors. And I would like to welcome all of you. Today's webinar is quite special. We have a lot of guests. We're going to be discussing the suggestion of the European Commission to include nuclear power and gas as green investments within the taxonomy. 2,300 EU citizens have decided to discuss the topic with our guests today. You can already see the first slide here, so you know what to expect. We have quite an intensive agenda, but we definitely look forward to listening to so many different positions, ideas, and proposals. And I'll briefly introduce our guests before they take the floor. Introducing all of them now would take too much time, but do take a look at that slide. We have so many attendees. It is clear that not everyone is going to be able to stay with us for 2 hours. People will be coming in and leaving us, which is why we have planned for Q&A sessions at different times so that you have the opportunity to ask questions. We're going to be using a tool for this today. I'll explain it in the chat. You can use this tool to ask your questions, but please only direct your questions at the people that have just spoken, just to ensure that we can keep all of this separated, and then I'll archive it afterwards. So simply ask questions for the people that have just taken the floor. And then at the end, we'll have a little more time, and then we'll see whether we can ask a few further questions. So use this pigeonhole that is now to be found in the chat. As you have seen, we're also live on YouTube, and everything's being recorded, and it is also going to be uploaded afterwards. So when you ask questions, well, if you don't want to mention your name or something, then don't do it. Just don't forget that it will be visible online. That would be it with regards to my introductory remarks. We are going to start off with our first keynote speech, and I would like to wholeheartedly welcome Karsten Löffler. He's the head of the Frankfurt School, UN Development Plan at the Frankfurt School for Finance and Management. He's also a member of the EU platform Sustainable Finance. He's a real expert with regards to sustainable finance, which is why we very much look forward to his keynote. Mr. Löffler, you have the floor. Thank you very much, and a good evening. Thank you, Mr. Fries, for the invitation. In my 10 minutes, I would like to speak about a few essential aspects of the EU Commission's proposal. I'll try to depict the perspective of the experts in our platform. I should also say that I do not speak on behalf of the platform explicitly. I will only be speaking in my name. Now, the question as to whether the proposal is in accordance with the requirements of the taxonomy regulation, well, as for that, there's different verdicts. So this begs the question whether this is a greenwashing act or not, and opinions differ here. And I will be speaking about 3 points to add to the discussion. I'll start by providing the content perspective. Often we only speak about whether gas and nuclear power should be included into the taxonomy or not. And in my opinion, the question is not if, but how. What do the economic activities have to do? Well, They have to do a substantial contribution to at least one of the EU goals, and they shouldn't significantly harm the others. The second thing we need to remember is that the technical expert group had already proposed in 2020 to take up fossil gas in the taxonomy, and with the criterion of the 100-gram CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour on a life cycle basis. In our opinion, this is okay, also in accordance with the requirement for other technologies. But of course, it's not easy to achieve. For gas-fired power plants, you would have to sequester CO2 for this. My third point is based on an observation. We have a mix-up of goals in this proposal. New goals have been added to the environmental goals. Supply security is one, price stability is another one. So in my opinion, it could become difficult when considering what the taxonomy is actually supposed to achieve when there is a mix-up here, because of course this leads to a conflict of goals. In this context, it's also interesting that the Commission has commissioned the platform to develop a concept for the extension of the taxonomy with a red, green, orange logic with regards to the economic activities and the environmental performance, but also with regards to activities that do not have a substantial positive or negative environmental impact. This is to be found in Article 26, paragraph 2 of the regulation, and plays an important role, especially with regards to fossil fuel, or fossil gas, in my opinion. There are 5 points that need to be observed critically in this proposal of the European Commission. Firstly, the technology neutrality. In 429b, there are exceptions for gas. In 429a, as I said, this is in accordance with the proposals of the technical expert group, but there are exceptions that are added here for gas. So then you might ask, why shouldn't we have these exceptions for other technologies, such as geothermal energy? Another aspect with regard to the exceptions is that the life cycle emissions for the hitherto mentioned exceptions do not need to be observed, even though for gas they do have, or they can have, a significant share when it comes to funding, transportation, or storage. And when it comes to adding low carbon gases, well, in my opinion, this isn't taken into consideration sufficiently. And then we also have the precautionary principle. And if we observe this principle, it becomes evident that this hasn't obtained sufficient importance when it comes to the do no significant harm criteria and their observance, especially in light of the requirement of the circular economy. But one can also look at pollution or the contamination requirements, also with regards to water measures. Now, number 4, there's also a contradiction, in my opinion, with existing delegated acts with regards to the avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions. Because aside from the 100 grams CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour that I hitherto mentioned, there's also a do not significant harm criterion for the area of climate adjustment amounting to 270 grams. And this interim area between 100 and 270 would be an area that is a so-called interim area and is already defined with the existing delegated act. And the new delegated act is not necessarily in conformity with the former one in this aspect. On top of that, my fifth point would be that the future orientation of many criteria is an essential point, also, which is also a problem for the financial sector. More about that later. Now, some of the criteria for gas and for nuclear power are only to be achieved in the faraway future. We're talking about 2035, 45, 50. And with regards to nuclear power plants, you may ask yourself the question how the contribution towards the EU reduction goals 2030 and 2050 is to look like if the corresponding plants will only be commissioned after 2040. I struggle finding viable arguments here. The addition of low carbon gases and renewable gases in 2035 is also to be marked with a number of question marks. What's the primary usage of hydrogen at that point in time? From today's perspective, it doesn't appear economical to go about this way, which is why this begs question. And if one was to operate low carbon gases, if one was to switch over entirely, then a large part of German agriculture would require this. Allow me to close with 2 points that are of relevance for the financial industry, in my opinion. I had already mentioned the future orientation of some of the criteria. This is an issue for financial institutes that want to provide funding, because it may well be that funds that qualify as green today turn out to not be green later on, and the taxonomy regulation doesn't foresee sanctions for this if these criteria aren't fulfilled in the future. After all, for financial institutions, this is associated with a significant reputation risk, which is why we might want to ask ourselves the question, how useful are these criteria from the perspective of financial institutes? Now, the second point that is certainly significant for European and global actors is the following. With the proposal, stronger national requirements may establish themselves that are stricter than the taxonomy. Here we have different limits in the different countries, and we have also heard from Spain, for example, or we have also heard signals from standard setters of private natures that are currently considering publishing their own taxonomy. I do not think that this is within the interest of a capital market union, because this would mean that we have different financial market products and funds in our different EU member states. In conclusion, gas and nuclear have perhaps a lower importance in the private industry. However, in my opinion, the EU Commission is sending a signal that it is saying goodbye to its own emission goals, that the credibility of the taxonomy is questioned here, and this could lead to reputational damage for the taxonomy as well as the sustainable finance agenda and the efforts of the European Commission. That would be it from me. Thank you.
Was ein großartiger Start in diesen
Thank you
Abend.
very much indeed. That was an excellent start into tonight's webinar. I would now like to pass the floor to our second keynote speaker, Dr. Götz Reichert. He is the head of the Department for European Energy Law at the Center of European Policy in Freiburg. Mr. Reichert, we look forward to your contribution, and I'll upload your transparencies. Thank you very much, Mr. Fries. Thank you for the friendly invitation. We, on a general basis, always look at European legislative acts from the perspective of the economy, but also the environment. And we did that with the first proposal on the taxonomy in 2018. Now, I would like to look at one of the legal questions, and that is whether the new delegated act that has been proposed violates against the basic European law with the criteria it sets. We wonder, obviously, whether it is useful and adequate to mark gas and nuclear power as sustainable with a view to the environment. That is one question, but we also need to look at the legal repercussions and preconditions. And I think that we will also be hearing from the ministers from Austria and from Luxembourg, Ms. Gewessler and her colleague from Austria. But let me first turn to the basic question in legal terms. We have looked at the procedure itself, and you might wonder whether this is not a very dry matter, but it's very important, of course, not only for the legal profession, but also for politicians. So the question is, was the European Commission in fact empowered to decide on the positioning of gas and nuclear power in the taxonomy? In view of this question, you need to look at the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. There's an article, and it is Article 290, excuse me. And this is indeed very important because anything in the field of taxonomy can actually be delegated to the Commission. And the Commission thus is then empowered to adopt non-legislative acts of general application in non-essential elements of the legislation, or it can supplement and amend certain parts of the legislative as essential elements reserved to the legislator. So you need to look at the question, what is the essentiality? The question arises whether non-essential matters were taken up and legislated in this particular delegated act. Normally, the EU legislator would be the European Parliament and the Council, and they normally have a rather complex process to go through for adopting a European law and legislation. Obviously, the delegation of power is quite useful if you want to quickly find relief for the EU legislator or quickly change something that has already been legislated. So the question is all about the balance, and the essentiality criterion is therefore important in the institutional balance, which needs to be preserved. It is the prerogative of the EU legislator to enact legislation and to then use the democratic process for allowing participation in the legitimization of any legislative act. It is quite a challenge to determine what is essential in this context and what isn't. If you look at the legal definition, some discussion can be had. You would then turn, obviously, to the European Court of Justice, look at the findings of the European Court of Justice, and there is quite a broad interpretation. Quite a number of tasks can be mandated or delegated, rather, to the European Commission, and the European Commission can also become an actor on the European level, and it must be able to take action. But the legislator also needs to follow and apply strict criteria, and they can be probed by the courts. There is not really a very much developed theory on essentialism, or perhaps, to say it in other words, it's very difficult to judge whether the European Commission has the power to act in this area, because it's not so essential. In my view, this question cannot be determined by simply going for a delegation of power and allowing the European Commission to use such a lean procedure, because we need to also look at the democratic participation. On the one hand, we have the processes, but on the other hand, we certainly have the participatory right of the politicians and the public at large. So we would have to establish the criteria to determine what is essential and what isn't. Some detailed provisions would need to be elaborated. We would perhaps look at the more unpolitical issues and the technical details and say that they are not really essential. But political issues are quite a different kettle of fish. So you would have to establish the criteria to find out whether with the decisions to be taken, some values are connected, some fundamental rights come into play, and there might also be a potential for conflict. All this would have to be considered. And I think looking at the strong debate and controversy around the climate policy and the climate change and the mitigation measures, it would seem quite disputable that judging gas and nuclear power along the climate taxonomy criteria would have to debate it on a much broader basis. It's a highly political matter, in my view. And of course, it's the individual member states who basically decide what their energy mix should be, what forms of energy they would like to support and to develop for the future. Preferences differ, and also the assessments on the environmental impact of nuclear power, for example, differs largely. And we've had a decade-long debate in Europe, and some countries then stepped out of nuclear power altogether, but others haven't, like France, for example, which has always maintained nuclear power plants and is expanding the capacity. So looking at the taxonomy and the classification in the taxonomy, you might take that lightly and you could say, well, it's just a label and it's not really mandatory. It's rather more voluntary, and some other legal acts will probably also be connected to the taxonomy, like any legislation on public aid and subsidies. However, all these topics are rather essential. So therefore, it would seem to me like a violation of Article 290 of the TFU, and therefore the European Court of Justice would basically have to declare the present delegated act as invalid. And I look forward to the debate. Thank you very much, Mr. Reichert. You have very nicely placed the ball in the camp of our other guests. And we would now turn to Leonore Gewessler, Federal Minister for Climate Protection, Environment, Energy, Mobility, Innovation, Technology in the Republic of Austria. We look forward to your contribution. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really fascinating to listen to you, and I would like to give you our take from Austria on this matter. The complementary delegated act really goes in the wrong direction for us in Austria, and it actually contravenes the central orientation of the basic idea. It's a fatal signal that the European Commission is sending out to the public. The Green Deal is a huge program and a very challenging and ambitious program. The Fit for 55 is also an excellent program which should help us to reach our objectives of lowering the emissions by 55% up to 2030. But this means that all other legislative acts must also follow suit, that they must support the objectives and the orientations. It actually waters down the credibility of the European Commission. The European Commission takes a step back from its ambitious plans, and it could actually cost us part of our future if the worst comes to the worst. And that is why we are intensively lobbying against this complementary delegated act. Dr. Reichert already said that we are preparing for taking action, and we have also mandated a study to find out whether there is a legal base for including this in the taxonomy. There are three different arguments that you can explore. The basic criterion is, can you take such a broad and long-running decision simply by a delegated act? We feel no should be the answer to that. And in the legal opinion, two other questions are also being looked at. One of the argument goes back to the process. The nuclear power having been coined as a transitory technology, you need to look at the taxonomy regulation with different eyes, because if you need to prepare for decades for such a technology, and then you use it for a certain number of years, and then afterwards you have all the follow-up, cleanup to do after having used such an energy source, we feel that the prerequisites are not met. And then, obviously, the main argument is do no significant harm, and we don't feel that this prerequisite is met either. During the last weeks, we have prepared since the proposal of the delegated act was submitted. We have looked at it in detail, of course. We will also be looking for further partners in the member states to take legal action. We have found a lot of support in other ministries, but it's such a basic question that it really needs to be clarified, and that is why we would really like to leave it to the courts to clarify this question. If you allow me to continue just a little more, I think it is important that the European Commission should follow its own principles and meet the objectives of the Green Deal, for example. Fossil gas is perhaps with the methane emissions not really the best option for a positive environment and less emissions. And if you look at other countries, how they excluded those sources of energy and have reduced the threshold limit values remarkably, then we feel that we should be following rather those examples than turning our back to the objectives that we set ourselves. And I think we need to fight for a credible environmental clause. Thank you very much.
Starken Input. Als nächstes.
Thank you very much for this input. Markus Ferber is next, MEP for the CSU and Speaker of the EPP party in the Committee for Economics and Money. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Hopefully you can all see me. I know this format quite well, so it's an honor to be a speaker here today. I've been dealing with the dossier intensively, also during the last legislative period. Back then, I was already the speaker of my party in the committee. This is a dossier that comes from the classification of financial instruments, and that is why we work on this together with the Environmental Committee in the European Parliament. Allow me to make a few additions to what has already been said. Why did we choose the instrument of a delegated act back then? Because everyone we asked said this is going to be a process where adjustments and changes might be required. To ensure that sustainability is achieved, and that is why it makes sense to do this via delegated acts that can be faster adjusted than starting a new lawmaking procedure. Back then, in the European Parliament, we also had votes on all the detailed topics, because it is true that the fundamental questions have to be sorted in laws and cannot be taken over by delegated acts. And if you do not agree with regards to jurisdiction, then you also won't agree with regards to delegated acts. And that's exactly the situation we find ourselves in today. Of course, back then there was a vote about whether CO2 or whether, well, but unfortunately there was no majority in the parliament. So the position was clear, and I also supported it to be explicit. For us in the parliament, the majority was not in favor of using nuclear energy as green energy. When it comes to gas, however, I have to say that the parliament by a majority decided that there have to be transition technologies that describe a path towards reduction. And that's also foreseen in the Act, of course, with the aim of transitioning towards hydrogen for the time when we want to have achieved climate neutrality. Now, of course, this needs to be taken a closer look at to see whether this is also fulfilled. On New Year's Eve, we were all confronted. I received an email at 10:30 on New Year's Eve. I have to admit that I only took a look at the email on the 1st of the 1st. And as a convinced MEP, I think it is important that the platform was informed and consulted. It was good that the member states were informed and consulted, but the parliament was only unofficially informed and not consulted. We are a lawmaker. We are also an issuer of regulations at the same level as the member states, and that is why I do not think it was acceptable that we were informed and not consulted, which is why I immediately launched the initiative in the new year with the colleagues, with the rapporteurs. That is why I ensured with this initiative that we expressed a writing in which we stated that we also want to be consulted. Now, in the last legislative period, we had a majority against nuclear energy. Now, we have to organize a rejection majority. Everyone agrees. It's going to be very difficult to organize a majority in the council. It will be easier to do so in the parliament. And that's what I'm currently focusing on to ensure that we reject this delegated act. Member states have the right to determine their energy mix. But when they do so, they should do it in a fair and transparent fashion, and it cannot be that nuclear and gas are classified as sustainable. Thank you very much. Some very important points. I'd like to pass the floor to Paul Tang from the Netherlands, our next MEP. A very good evening. He's shadow rapporteur for S&D, so for the Social Democratic Party in the European Parliament. Dear Paul Tang, welcome, and we look forward to your speech.
I understand I can speak in English. I understand German, but speaking is much harder. And I didn't get all the contributions this far because I was just having in my group the Socialists and Democrats and a discussion on taxonomy on the delegated act. I'll tell you a bit more about it later. But it shows it's on top of the agenda. The general feeling is, of course, that it's not in line with the taxonomy regulation, the delegated act. I was involved in drafting the primary legislation, the taxonomy regulation itself. And you only have to glance at it. You only have to glance at the regulation to see that the delegated act is not in line. For example, transitional technology should be best in class, or life cycle analysis should be conducted. This is simply ignored in the delegated act. But it's not just this argument that it makes in my group in the European Parliament the most impact, I also make the argument that the Commission has come forward with a delegated act and has taken a very political, high-level political decision through the back door, to which it's very difficult to organize a majority in council, and it's also difficult to organize a majority in parliament against it. And I think the Commission should have used the front door. If you want to introduce gas and nuclear as transitional technologies, open up the primary legislation. We have a debate in the council and in parliament. That is the way it should be done. And now we have seen, and Marcus Weber already pointed out to this, the parliament has been more or less sidelined. Indeed, on New Year's Eve, 10:30, we got the first version of the delegated act. We had little input in it. The consultation period was short, and again, the Commission shouldn't have to use the front door, the back door of a delegated act, but the front door of primary legislation. That would have been the way forward. So one could argue it's a compromise, but let's face it, it's a very poor compromise. It has stepped on many toes, touched on many sensitivities, and I think it has upset almost everyone, including, which I find very interesting, also the financial markets. We see many institutional investors speaking out against this delegated act, against including gas and nuclear under the label of green, and it just shows that this only leads to more confusion, and this is not very productive. Now, of course, once we realized that the delegated act was coming forward, our job is to organize this majority against the delegated act. This is why the discussion in the group is also very important, because I try to keep the group as united as possible. And overall, I think there will be there's a clear majority that wants to say no to this delegated act. Yet there are some people that point out that we need to make sure that energy is affordable, that we need to provide energy security. And this is why I will also, as a way of compromise, look forward not just to say no, but also to say yes to transitional investments. The platform for sustainable finance will also come forward with this with an amber category, and so that we don't always just say no, but also say yes, but in all honesty, also to make sure that indeed it is a no to this delegated act. And then we go back to the revision of the primary legislation, take the front door, and discuss what possibilities there should be in the transition. And I just had a discussion with for example, my Polish colleagues to say, yeah, 70% of our energy is from coal-powered plants. We don't know what to do if we want to make this transition. Now, there should be options on the table, but that's a discussion worth having. But very clear from our point of view, we want to say no to this delegated act, not through the back door. If we have a discussion, it should be through the front door to a revision of the primary legislation. That's what we aim for, and I very much hope that you will join us in our fight to win the majority for the objection against this delegated act.
Ja, herzlichen Dank. Jetzt können sich gerne Frau Ministerin Gewessler.
Thank you very much, Minister Gewessler, Mr. Fermer, and Whole Tang can keep their cameras on. I'm sure you all have other things to do this evening, so we'll perhaps do a short question and answer round, questions that we have received. I'll start with you, Minister Gewessler. We received one question. You said that you have spoken to other member states to ask them to participate in a potential lawsuit. What about Germany? Have there been any discussions with Germany, and are you expecting support from the Federal Republic?
Bei den Mitgliedstaaten ja derzeit schon die Situation, wir haben mehr Mitgliedstaaten in der Europäischen Union.
We have more member states in the European Union that have decided to leave nuclear power or never use nuclear power. And we have talked to Spain, to Denmark, but also Germany. In order to combat the classification of nuclear energy as sustainable.
Luxembourg, aber da will ich Carole Dieschbourg, meiner lieben Kollegin, nicht vorgreifen, hat bereits
Luxembourg has already announced that it too intends to take legal steps. We are also having discussion with other partners. Robert Habeck already said publicly that potential steps may be taken. We're going to prepare this and then we'll decide together as to how we intend to proceed. Thank you very much. Then one question for Mr. Ferber. Can you achieve a majority within the EPP against this delegated act? Do you think that within your party you will be able to achieve a majority? I couldn't tell you whether we have a majority now. What is decisive is that at the end we'll have a majority in the parliament. Within our party, we have all kinds of positions. As for Austria, we only have Austrians and no party members. In the German delegation that I belong to, I think we have a majority against it, but there are, of course, also proponents, especially because of the gas share. Well, in Germany, the last 3 nuclear power plants will be turned off at the end of the year. As for the French, I don't think we'll necessarily win any votes, but the vote will take place after the French elections. So perhaps some changes may take place there too. My estimate is that we'll vote at the earliest in July in the European Parliament. Scandinavia is very enthused about nuclear energy, whereas from Southern Europe, I have heard a lot of rejection. So if I may summarize, we have a good humus upon which decisions can be taken. But we have prepared the soil, and I think the EPP will be able to contribute towards a rejection of the delegated act. Thank you very much. One question for you, Mr. Tang. Perhaps 2 questions, but I'll start with one. You mentioned affordable energy prices, which of course is an important topic for many people, rightfully so. The question is that trade unions also fear that a poor deal could also have an effect on other areas, i.e. the credibility of the social taxonomy, which of course is an important topic for social democrats too. Do you share this opinion that this could be a danger, that this could have an effect on other areas, also on social political areas?
Personally, why I'm deeply annoyed with the decision by the Commission. It goes to the credibility of the taxonomy. And the taxonomy needs to be credible if it is a guide for private and public investors. And the credibility is at stake. And in that sense, you already see the confusion, sometimes the negative reactions from institutional investors, just showing that the financial markets are far from happy with this. And originally it started as a guide for private investors, but I think it's also a guide for public investors. So if the credibility is at stake, you need to fight for this credibility. And in my mind, it has always been, it's about environment, social and governance, the E, the S and the G, impact investment. It's a broad concept. And if the credibility on E, on the green, is destroyed, of course, we won't get the credibility back on the S and the G. I do think that's important if we want to make markets work for people and planet. That's my deep conviction. So personally, I'm very deeply annoyed with it, and I think it will have a detrimental negative effect on as an instrument for private and public investment. It's exactly why we need to fight against this. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Dann sage ich ganz herzlichen Dank an Frau.
In that case, I would like to thank you, Mrs. Gewessler, Mr. Ferber, and Mr. Tang. Thank you very much for starting this conference. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and good luck for your combat, one could say. Right, we're going to move on with Michael Bloss. Dear Michael, he is the climate political speaker of the Green Party in the European Parliament, so he's a further MEP. You now have your own slot, your own possibility to speak about the situation in the European Parliament. You have the floor.
Lieber Max und
Thank you very much, dear Max, and I'd like it to say hello to all of you. A lot has already been said, and I think it is exciting to be listening to you. And it's also very interesting to see that others in other parties of the European Parliament also look at what's going on in a very critical way. We definitely think that it is a historic mistake that was made by the European Commission, because to mitigate the climate change, we really need to end certain technologies and energies. And we work on it with the climate package, Fit for 55. But it also takes many more other activities and measures in the financial taxonomy or financial field, more generally speaking. And taxonomy should really serve that purpose, not only energy, but also circular economy and other economic spheres. Now, if you make that mistake and say in the energy sector, anything goes, you can use renewables, but you can also use fossil gas or nuclear power, then you all of a sudden lose your orientation, and it cannot be used in a very targeted manner anymore. But it's so important to be sure of the taxonomy and the classification per se, also for the financial market, and that is why we are decided to go against it. Look at South Korea, for example. They have also changed their taxonomy for sustainability and have included gas. So the step taken by the European Commission already has a global impact. And the French, for example, have introduced a label which does not include nuclear, but they will replace it by the European one. And that also puts us before a new problem. So we really have great difficulties with it, because it will also probably develop into a huge machinery of allowing subsidies for nuclear power plants. There is something like a free pass available. For gas, it's slightly different, I have to say, because there are quite a number of criteria that were set. They may not be ever so effective, but in 2030, the complete switch to low carbon gases must become operational. So after 2030, no power plant can be fueled with fossil gas. And that's not so easy for Eastern European countries, for example, where the coal-fired power plants would then have to be fired, for example, by hydrogen. it is a huge challenge to have it available at the right moment in time. And that is why France probably opts for even more capacity in nuclear power. So let's not be mistaken. The regulation on taxonomy has huge repercussions on other pieces of legislation. We have the green bonds, for example. The green bonds should also be guided by the taxonomy. And also, the debt question should be looked at freshly by, for example, allowing that debt would not be counted in the national deficit any longer if the debt was taken out for environmental purposes, for example. So it has huge impacts on many other fields. Many voices have been raised in the European Parliament against the submitted delegated act. We have 4 months time to organize ourselves. We can then go a little longer, all the way into August, and find the 353 votes within the European Parliament to simply reject it, because we can't count on the Council rejection. And I really look forward to working together in the European Parliament, in the core of European democracy, in order to do away with that cheat. It's interesting how the members of the European Parliament really watch the time, because they know that they'll be cut off. Let's go to Volker Weber. He is the chairman of the board for Nachhaltige Geldanlagen e.V. and a member of the Supervisory Board of Eurosif in Brussels. Mr. Weber, welcome to you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here to come in. I'd like to take something up that the speaker before me said. Let's look at things that exist already and don't regulate everything new and fresh all the time. We think that it is important to look at the regulation on taxonomy and the disclosure regulation. They were good pieces of legislation because the volume of investment went up tremendously in Europe, and many institutional investors have actually started investing in this area. But we have only looked at 2 environmental objectives, and we are still missing 4 of them. And I'd like to support Mr. Löffler. The Commission is not looking at the green transformation, but looking at the supply side, making sure that the supply in future is guaranteed. And we see very clearly that for the past 20 years, nothing has really happened. No effective strategy in many of the European member states has made sure that we have a supply guarantee for energy in the future. We see a danger of European member states drifting apart along their national interests, because in some countries the interest is huge for nuclear power. For some, the interest in gas is very strong. And I talked to the representative of a huge insurance company, and they said, well, we cannot simply say no to these sources of energy because some of our clients want them. So I think we definitely need to look for new directions. We need guidance nowadays. And the new label in Europe has been analyzed by us, and only 2 of the sustainability measures would actually be granted the label. So I think the transformation would not be helped along very effectively. In Germany, we have an advantage that in as much as we started already in 2015 together with Switzerland and Austria to offer bonds that were environmentally sustainable, and many institutionalized investors are interested in it. Many cities and local authorities are interested in investing into such funds or bonds. But one of the major problems right now is the huge sense of insecurity, of legal insecurity. There's an action plan, there's the taxonomy regulation, but all the dates have been shifted. All the investors were to be asked for their sustainability references, and we are missing the criteria. And now the date has been shifted by 6 months or even a full year by the European Commission, and that does not lead to security in the market. So we desperately need to know very quickly how will things develop from now. What are the states going to opt for, even if the fine-tune of the regulation is not there yet? We just need to have an idea for the way forward. And we need a signal that yes, we do want sustainability, and no, nuclear power and fossil gas don't belong in that field, and sustainability goes much further than just looking at those sources of energy. Thanks. Thank you very much. That was a very important new perspective that you brought into this debate. Thank you very much. And I'd like to pass the floor to Magdalena Senn. She is responsible for the sustainable financial markets in the Bürgerbewegung Finanzwende, and we've worked together frequently, and I'm very happy to see you, Magdalena. Thanks very much, Max. I'd like to be very short and succinct. In our view, the European Commission is simply opting for greenwashing. If nuclear power and fossil gases are categorized as sustainable, and it falls back on the established standards. Even the French label for sustainable funds excludes nuclear power, and it is a fatal signal that is going out to the general public. And it is being sent by the European Commission. This devalues the taxonomy, and we're not looking at the specifics of the threshold limit values. We simply consider the credibility of taxonomy. And unfortunately, we're now heading into a situation where the parallel existence of different sustainability labels will simply cause confusion amongst investors and consumers. And the whole idea of setting standards in Europe is coming to a complete shambles. And the European Commission is jeopardizing its own objectives by not really combating greenwashing. And for decades, we've been going down the wrong road with these transitory technologies. We're not even considering the question which member state needs which source of energy for how many years in order to come to climate neutrality. Of course, they can use the energy, but they don't need a green label for it. And we shouldn't destroy the green or environmental and sustainability label. And I think we also need to look very critically at the present government in Germany. We need to separate very clearly our arguments in the debate, because we look on the one hand at the energy supply for the future, but that's a totally different matter. You do not at the same time need to loosen the rules and the provisions for gas and at the same time become more strict on nuclear power. The French will want the nuclear power in future, and you simply have to find a way forward to remain credible in this area of taxonomy. With other associations of the civil society, Campact, they will later on speak also. We have started a campaign and collected signatures and asked everyone to simply vote with no and to join a group action against this delegated act. And that's our take. Thanks. Thanks very much. Michael Bloss and Volker Weber are very welcome to join us again with their cameras on, and perhaps we can organize another round of questions. I would like to start with Mr. Weber, and the others may come in, of course. In her press conference, the competent commissioner said, well, what would happen if the power plant did not comply with the regulations? And she said, "Oh, they have their image to lose, and therefore they will make sure that the provisions are met." Do you believe that sort of discourse? How can we make sure that that the rules are being complied with? Is it only the image that might be destroyed? I think we do need the credibility. In Eurosif, we have a French president of the French Association, of course, and they are all for the nuclear power. In Germany, for example, they're all against it. And what the European Commission forgets is that you have to plan such a power plant, then you have to build it and take it into operation. It takes a lot of time. You have no idea how we will be discussing certain aspects of limit values in 10 or 15 years. So it's not just a possibility to align the operation of such a power plant to new regulations. Should you not use perhaps the capacities to develop more renewable power generation? You don't need to produce green hydrogen in Chile. We do have the possibility to produce it at the North Sea coast in Germany, for example. All these things should also be considered. And of course, you would need funding into the development of those generation plants. And I don't think that a lot of capital will be invested into a a transitional energy source because you will be financing stranded assets. Would the other two like to come in on that, or shall we take up another question, a political question, perhaps? And you can you can choose who will answer.
So there's the general impression that gas and nuclear taxonomy compromise is arranged between Mr. Scholz and Mr. Macron, but Germany basically gets consent by France for gas power stations, and Germany gets, and France gets consent for nuclear power stations. So what is your opinion on that, and is that view also shared in Germany in particular? Yes, so who wants to have that question?
Ich kann ja da mal anfangen.
Perhaps I can start. I really don't know. I don't know what they discussed, Scholz and Macron. But it does look a little bit like a gift from Scholz to Macron with regards to nuclear power. But all this is really a rumor. But it is a mistake, just like the mistake of Ms. von der Leyen, the Commission President, because they simply do it by a delegated act. We're not even being consulted. There were letters from the European Parliament to the Commission that have been ignored, and the letter simply said, please consult us. We have a right to be consulted. It is the sheer ignorance of the European Parliament that is becoming really a stumbling stone for the European Commission because the members of the Parliament are not amused, and we cannot simply be ignored. And then there's another very interesting question from Nina Treschke, perhaps to Magdalena Zen. She asks, why did the term taxonomy get chosen? It is something that perhaps the ordinary citizen in the street will not understand at all. It all looks very complicated. How do you explain that? Yeah, indeed, it is a difficult term, but at the same time, it's a term that comes from biology. It simply means classification, and it's a classification into something sustainable and something unsustainable. And we need to make sure that the Commission proposal gets properly understood. That's why we work a lot with the standards and the seals. It doesn't really work very well with the taxonomy because you first need the taxonomy or the classification to then introduce such a standard or perhaps a seal. But I think it's fascinating to see that even in comedy broadcasts there is a reference to what's going on at the European level, that French fries all of a sudden are classified as salad because nuclear power was classified as environmentally sound. But we look into explaining it to the citizens. 2,300 people registered for this event, and I think that your contribution to making this understood is huge. Let's close this question and answer round, and we come to the last part of the webinar. I would like to welcome the Minister for Environmental Affairs, Carole Dieschbourg, and we are happy to have you.
Vielen lieben Dank, lieber Maximilian.
Thank you very much, dear Maximilian Fries. And I too would like to greet all participants. We have heard a number of presentations and statements this evening, and this gives me great hope that this delegated act, which we fundamentally question, where we fundamentally say this cannot be, from a legal perspective, and the question of essentiality was discussed in the first presentation already. But there's also a clear democracy deficit that has already been mentioned by previous speakers. So for Luxembourg, it is clear that with regards to essentiality, but also with regards to the deficits of involvement, well, it is clear that we have to push against this fundamentally. And for us in Luxembourg, it is clear that nuclear energy and fossil gas cannot be part of the taxonomy. This undermines the credibility, and I agree with the previous speakers. This is a step back, and we're undermining the goals we have established over the last years. We were the first big force to say we want to be climate neutral with the Green Deal. We want to take a big step and be the worldwide leader for climate protection. And this is all now being undermined with this delegated act. That's Luxembourg's position. And in our statement, we also expressed that one element that is very important to us is the participation of the public. This is important when it comes to essential matters relating to the environment. Now, I don't want to repeat what the Minister Gewessler has already said, but as for the contents, we want to join Austria's lawsuit. Luxembourg has already announced this to the wider public. So we agree legally and with regards to the contents of Austria's statement that nuclear energy isn't a transition technology. It takes 10-15 years to plan. Until today, there still aren't any solutions with regards to radioactive waste. We are speaking about technologies that do not exist today. And we also believe that the do not cause any harm principle isn't being respected here. So that is why I am very pleased that these points were mentioned by the previous speakers this evening. It's also clear that this is a highly sensitive and political discussion that is going to have effects on future decisions if we say today nuclear power and gas is green. In preparation, I was asked the question, what should we do now? Similarly to the Minister Gewessler, we too are going to be looking for allies. We're permanently talking to other countries that also have a critical viewpoint of this delegated act. We are in constant touch. I will also be traveling to Berlin tomorrow in order to have discussions with the responsible persons. I'll be meeting Mrs. Lemke, for example. Taxonomy is on our agenda, so we'll certainly be speaking about this. It is extremely important that we now all work on all levels, in the parliament, in the governments. We have to mobilize in order to take this topic seriously. At the moment, it's only Austria and Luxembourg that have clearly expressed themselves. And we decided in our government council that if this remains the same way, then we will certainly start an action. So we are currently preparing on this. I'm less optimistic about the Council than the European Parliament, because many countries might be critical with regards to one or the other point, but a lot of convincing work still remains to be done, which is why I'm extremely grateful that this panel was organized today. The number of participants and the number of guest speakers who say democracy is being brought in through the back door here, well, it is clear that we are dealing with crucial questions here, also with regards to the credibility of European climate policy. And that is why I am so very pleased that we are having this discussion here this evening. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much for these words of praise. I do feel like something is moving here in the wider European public, and that's great. So thanks to everyone who has decided to join us. We're now going to give Sascha Müller-Krenner the floor. He is co-head of Deutsche Umwelthilfe. Many of you know it, and that is why we very much look forward to your input now. Thank you very much for this invitation, and greetings from my living room in Berlin. I would like to say something about our legal opinion that we have commissioned, and then I'll also speak about our intentions. And similarly to Mr. Ferber, I woke up on January 1st and saw that the Commission had sent a proposal briefly before midnight. And we have received feedback that nobody quite understands how this could happen. And nobody understands this in Germany in the public discussion, be it the press, be it politicians, or be it the citizens that have gotten in touch with us. Of course, especially with regards to nuclear power, Germany decided to phase out nuclear energy for good reasons. And that is why you cannot explain to anyone in Germany why nuclear energy is now supposed to be sustainable. And if the EU household is to be based on the taxonomy, then of course this is going to have far-reaching effects. This is something nobody understands and nobody wants. When it comes to natural gas, of course, the situation is slightly different. I saw this in the chat. This had been already discussed. Of course, natural gas is going to be required for a certain amount of time, and further investment into infrastructure will be required, but that doesn't make it sustainable. If I go into the supermarket and I have normal tomatoes and organic tomatoes, then I also do not want the normal tomatoes to be labeled as organic tomatoes, which is why the sustainable label for natural gas is a form of greenwashing. It has to be said. And the criteria for the natural gas infrastructure, which are to be found in the taxonomy, are of course needed. They aren't fitting, I have to say. And of course, we need such criteria, but please not in the taxonomy, and especially not in a delegated act. A delegated act that hasn't been democratically discussed in the European Parliament, as some of the previous speakers have said. And as a consequence, we said that we want to legally examine this. And that is why we also commissioned a legal audit, especially with regards to the gas. I'm certainly going to post a link to this in the chat. I do not want to give a legal presentation here because after all, we're not only lawyers here, but allow me to speak about a few of the essential points. The main statement of our legal opinion is that Germany has to join the lawsuit because in the Article 20a of the German Constitution, there is the obligation to contribute towards environmental laws. So when it comes to designing European laws, Germany has to contribute and ensure that the environmental goals are also adhered to. After the decision of the Constitutional Court as to the climate protection, we believe that this is no longer the case, which is why we believe that the federal government of Germany is obliged to examine a lawsuit at least. This obligation is also the result of the precautionary principle of the European Union, by the way. Now, others have mentioned this in the course of the discussion. That is why I'm not going to be explaining this in any detail, but also in our opinion, the taxonomy regulation doesn't provide for a delegated act, which has to move within the framework of the taxonomy regulation, now opens the door for nuclear power and fossil gas. In Article 10, for example, of the taxonomy regulation, it is clearly stipulated that all technologies have to contribute towards protecting the environment, and natural gas doesn't fulfill this obligation. And it, of course, also hampers the indirect funding.
Es gibt auch Artikel 16 der Taxonomie.
Article 16 of the taxonomy regulation is also worth mentioning. Gas is not an enabling activity. Now, steel production, for example, is an enabling activity and gas isn't.
Umweltziele durch Erdgas, durch die Erdgasförderung, durch den Erdgas.
And of course, the promotion of natural gas is also not in line with other goals to be found within the regulation. I'm not going to be speaking in detail about nuclear power, even though this legal opinion did also examine this. Last but not least, I would like to say something about the criteria for natural gas in the delegated acts and what bothered us specifically. Here we're opening the door to permanently operating gas-powered power plants. Plants that are going to be built until 2030. Well, for those, an unlimited operation on a fossil basis is possible. There's no effective obligation to switch towards climate neutral green hydrogen. It is also possible to use blue hydrogen when switching over to other so-called climate neutral gases, which, by the way, aren't clearly defined either. Now, of course, it is an energy-intensive process, but let's not forget that it also creates methane, a highly potent climate gas, which has significantly worse effects than CO2, by the way. Now, the political conclusion is, firstly, we demand that the government votes with a no in the European Council when it comes to the delegated acts, and we demand that Germany also organizes this rejection with other countries that have already expressed their criticism. An abstention won't suffice. The government has to vote with a no here. And if the Council and the European Parliament do not reject and stop this delegated act, we demand that the German government joins Austria's and Luxembourg's lawsuit. We're also going to take a look at the Aarhus Convention and the lacking participation in this context. That too is a topic that we're going to take a closer look at. So I'll post a link in the chat and I look forward to our discussion afterwards. Great, thank you very much. It's surprising that after 10 speakers, we still have novel aspects. It's really nice to see how far-reaching this topic is. And we're also going to be introducing a new aspect now at the end of our meeting. I would like to welcome Nina Katzenmush. She is the EU campaigner for lobby control. And she's also one of the founding members of Europe Calling. Dear Nina, hopefully you haven't disappeared when reading the questions. There she is. We can't hear you yet. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that there are so many good questions that it was difficult to decide when taking a look at them. Nina, welcome. You have the floor. You have 5 minutes. We look forward to your speech. So many important things have already been said. I'll try to speak about an aspect that hasn't been mentioned all that much yet, but there have been questions about it. Everyone's asking, how could the Commission do this? The response is somewhat evident. It was mentioned in all of the discussions. We think that the member states play an extremely important role. Of course, Germany and France are at the front here, but there are other member states that have also done their utmost to ensure that the demands are met. But of course, we're talking about a green label here, but to call a spade, everybody wants their dirty technologies to be funded via this label. And whether it is clean or not is something that a lot of the member states don't consider all that important, it seems. That's something we observe regularly. There's a proposal which sometimes isn't all that bad, but of course the main goal is to defend the own national interests. I firstly thought I'd look at France and Germany, and then this afternoon I thought, no, perhaps we'll look behind the curtains in Germany, because of course this is the area that we can observe closely. Now, the old government wanted gas within the taxonomy right from the onset. This was clearly expressed in statements. So it was quite clear from that point that gas needed to be included in the taxonomy. The former coalition has strong ties to the gas industry. In the framework of the Gas Strategy 2030, the Ministry for Economic Affairs got together with a gas lobby to plan for a lot of gas infrastructure to be built over the next years. I'm somewhat exaggerating, says the speaker, but it is true. Then Nord Stream 2 was, of course, pushed through, even though most of the EU member states didn't agree with this. And then one worked closely together with institutions such as the DINA. DINA is an agency that we have taken a closer look at a few times already this year. The head of the DINA is also in the Council Initiative Zukunft Gas, which I'll speak more about later on. And then in autumn, there was a transition period. A lot of environmental organizations were hopeful that the new coalition would now say, no, not with this taxonomy. We're going to take all of this back. But it didn't turn out this way. In the coalition treaty, it was already clearly stated that gas is required for the transition period, which might be appropriate. But this also meant that there was the opinion that gas must also be included in the taxonomy. But this doesn't, we're not at the end of the story yet. We saw how the government, in a further step, tried to soften the criteria for the gas-fired power plant in the taxonomy. There was a statement which suggested softening the criteria to ensure that gas receives the green label, and the demands put forth there always correspond with what we see today. Of course, the gas industry has a huge budget for lobbying, has great contacts to politicians. I mentioned Mr. Kuhlmann before from the DENA already, and of course there are strong ties to other members of parliament. And the Commission, well, I want to somewhat protect the Commission here this evening. The demands made back then weren't immediately welcomed by the Commission. I'm not an expert, says the Speaker. Only one of the demands was taken up when it comes to adding hydrogen at an earlier point in time, and I'm quite happy that it didn't go down this path. Let me put it this way. There's not going to be a lot of protest in Germany against this taxonomy. I think this is something we need to be ready for. As long as the Germans want gas within the taxonomy, they're not going to say anything about nuclear energy or nuclear power to be within the taxonomy. So I don't think we can count on the government. But I look forward to seeing how the MEPs are going to deal with this new situation in the European Parliament. And I do hope that despite of the fierce lobbying, there still is hope to avoid this greenwashing.
Ganz lieben Dank. Und dann schließen wir uns.
Thank you very much. And then we will close the big loop with Mira Jäger. She is campaigner in Campact. They organize the civil society. That's my take on Campact. Mira Jäger, we look forward to hear from you, especially with a view of your activities, your campaigns in the coming few months. Thanks very much. I really have to say that I felt a little bit like everyone else. This taxonomy proposal of the European Commission was a bad surprise at New Year's. And in order to mobilize against it, we appealed to the federal government, together with some other civil society associations, to definitely reject the proposal and, if need be, to take legal action before the court. And there have been massive protests against the classification of fossil gas and nuclear power as environmentally sustainable. We have definitely been able to prove that so many people are not agreeable with channeling funds and investments into non-sustainable sources of energy. Unfortunately, it doesn't look ever so realistic that the Council of Ministers will reject the proposal from the Commission, and that is why we think that the federal government must do everything in their power to stop the proposal. There are very strong signals from the civil society in Germany. They can't simply ignore that because the signals are very strong. So we feel that the federal government will definitely have to do something, and as a matter of last resort, perhaps really bring action before the European Court of Justice. And Magdalena referred to the campaign, to the petition which has been signed by hundreds of people already. I think we will have to keep up the pressure because the federal minister Habeck, for example, is considering taking legal action, but the government itself in its totality has not even contemplated this idea. And I don't think that it will happen if we cannot build up the pressure from the civil society. We should at least try to move them with the civil pressure. Campact also is very interested, of course, in supporting members of European Parliament to stop the taxonomy proposal. And we would be very, very interested in supporting that, but we must be pragmatic and realistic. It's certainly not sufficient to simply convince the the German members of the European Parliament to reject the proposal. So we're now looking for allies in other EU member states to organize the European civil society against this proposal. And we hope that we will become very powerful in our rejection against this taxonomy proposal in the European Parliament. Until that happens, every individual citizen can do something, I think, because you can turn to your member of parliament in the European Parliament in your own region and simply ask them how they will vote. Do take up the opportunity to get into personal contact with your member of the European Parliament, at least also with the members of the EPP and the Renew group, because I'm pretty certain that they need to be convinced in order to vote against it. Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was also a very future-oriented contribution to this debate, because you remind us of the fact that we really need to do our utmost for the coming 6 months to work against it. And as someone who used to work for a member of the European Parliament, I can assure you that those letters that the citizens write to their members in Parliament get read and even answered. I don't know who of our guest speakers are still there. Those who would like to join us in the last round of the debate can open the camera again, perhaps, in order to join us here in this final round of the debate. And of course, we are faced with the impossible task to answer 43 questions in 15 minutes. That won't work, of course. That is why I think we should vote on the questions in the pigeonhole. I would like to ask you to vote, and we would then be very strict and take them one by one. We talked a lot about democracy here today, and I would simply raise the questions that get the majority vote. And I think it's fascinating to see how many questions you actually put in. The most voted question is an anonymous question. Should the EU taxonomy contain gas and nuclear power? Who are the actors who will be giving money? EU, the states, the banks, or others? And what are the sums? What would be the amounts that we would need to consider? But it has been said in the past that this also has its repercussions on other areas. So what happens if the taxonomy becomes applicable as it has been submitted? And if what happens, what would be the amounts? Who would like to come in on that one? Mr. Löffler, please. Well, the question is what's behind it. Of course, we can speculate, but some of the speakers already said it tonight. They said that some of the sources of energy needed more funding, which perhaps need to be repaired or refurbished. This part of the energy sources in the total balance is not so huge, but look at the broader level, at the European level in total. That's just my private view. I think financing of this technology will only be done through bonds of bigger and taken or issued by bigger institutions, but they do have their own criteria, and they will also define what they regard as sustainable and what the investment criteria would be. The same is true for gas. You have to balance the risks against future changes in the climate legislation, and a private investor will always consider that, of course. Taking the investment decision is up to the individual, of course. Okay, thanks very much. Would someone like to add to that? Magdalena? Yes, I would like to supplement that. I think, first of all, we need to look at the question of whether the investors will invest into green products. We simply wanted a clarification for the jungle of opportunities to invest into so-called environmentally sustainable products. There are so many funds that simply hide away coal, gas, and other investment that they also finance. So taxonomy was regarded as an opportunity to get the clarification, but we still don't have it. So my fear is that the chaos will continue and that atomic power and others will continue to be classified as sustainable. Perhaps if we look at it from a different perspective, some actors are not very knowledgeable about the technology, and they want a simple possibility to understand whether this would be a green investment or not. And looking at the practical way forward of a greater investor, they cannot really tell whether this is really a green investment or not. And this is why it's so tremendously important to clarify what's in it. And for the time being, this is highly difficult. I think with time, this will be solved. We'll probably have a phase of experimenting with such investments and the search for clarification, but we do in the capital market with investors, we need to be clear that only the label green can apply to something that's really green. Thank you very much. I always have to look at two screens. I think we can take up another question, one more question, which was voted. It's a bit like a strategic question. It comes up again and again. To which extent will taxonomy become topical in the funding decisions or will the delegated act damage the Green Deal objectives to such an extent that it should be rejected, or should we rather support taxonomy as a principle? Because the European Parliament could definitely also withdraw all the legislative act on taxonomy. Let me try and answer the first part of it. Regarding the first proposal of New Year's, the European Commission has improved the provisions on reporting in order to improve transparency. At the level of a company, for example, you need to be able to report. Financial institutes also need to report. And they also need to clarify the positions. They need to clarify which part of the taxonomy attaches the green label to which technology. So you clearly need all the pieces of information to bring them together in one package. And a lot of understanding and knowledge, and also the sheer will to look into the nitty-gritty of it is necessary. So you can now claim that nothing is hidden, but whether this is really helpful for practical questions, I'm not sure. Anyone else for questioning the entire taxonomy? I would just simply like to say that for the European Parliament, we really want a taxonomy. We like taxonomy, but we reject the second delegated act. And I think it does make a lot of sense. A taxonomy in itself, the sustainability for the financial world is important. Well, from my view as a practitioner, I can tell you that it all depends on a consistent and credible concept, which you have to be able to apply without running any risk of going down the wrong way. So if you wrap something up in a package and you label it somehow, then you need to be able to find something that complies with the label on the package, and then look at the question of credibility. That would be our take. Thanks very much. I have one supplementary question myself. I will simply vote it to the top. A question on the legal action before the court to Minister Dieschbourg. What we see is a strong move from the right-wing parties against the European Court of Justice. And taking legal action could perhaps also offer an opportunity to the right-wing politicians to to go against such moves again, because there are so many Eurosceptics who are very critical of such measures. Mr. Weber was also referring to the sense of insecurity. How long would it take to take such action, and how long would the sense of insecurity persist? So perhaps the minister first, and then Dr. Reichert. Well, we have not taken the legal action yet, and we won't be taking it tomorrow. This takes some time. It's a process of taking the decision. One of the members of the parliament already said that we have 4 months, and then perhaps there'll be an extension by another 2 months, and we will either have to prepare our action ourselves to enter into the litigation phase, or we will have to join forces with Austria. That for the time being, we're trying to mobilize, and that's why I'm so happy about this webinar here tonight. Simply clarify what we're talking about. How can we motivate people? Let's not question taxonomy in itself. Let's simply reject the proposal on the proposal for the delegated act. That's not the last piece of legislation that will come in this area and under the taxonomy chapter. I think the question really is, how can we reach our own objectives that we approved ourselves, and how can we become a real trailblazer for conservation, for the environment, for sustainability, and into which objectives and technologies are we going to invest the funds of our states and other investors. What is at stake is the future of Europe. And which road is Europe going to travel down? Do we want to stick to the climate change policy, to the Green Deal? We're receiving so many signals that there shouldn't be a move to fossil sources of energy and not to nuclear power. And I think we must make sure that we don't misunderstand each other. We really have to fight for Europe and for a good policy. And I think we are fighting for more Europe in actual fact, because we're asking ourselves, what are the possibilities of the Commission? Is a delegated act the right instrument to take such a far-reaching decision? Such an essential decision. There's a deficit of democracy that I perceive, and we need to convince the citizens that democracy works at the European level, and that is why we also said that in our opinion. We don't have to look at the content only. We also need to consider how we can make Europe bigger, how we can get more Europe, and the democratic principles may not be watered down.
Ja, kurz zur Frage Zeithorizonts. Der ist eben nicht kurz.
That's the question of the time horizon. Well, it isn't short. That's the way things go with justice. One generally goes about slowly but surely. So we're not speaking about weeks. We're also not speaking about months. Such a lawsuit can take longer.
And
that can be an issue in this case, because of course it leads to uncertainty, because we are talking about investments here as well, especially with regards to the taxonomy, which is supposed to be sending a signal. So such a lengthy procedure can be problematic, but when it comes to time horizon, we're not speaking about weeks. But I do think that it does make sense for the courts to take the sufficient time to take a closer look at all of the arguments that have also already been mentioned here this evening. Thank you very much. Our time has unfortunately run out. I have to say, these were great 2 hours. I have learned a lot, and I've felt a lot of energy and hope amongst a lot of the participants that the last word hasn't been spoken with regards to gas and nuclear power in the taxonomy. I'll speak for another minute before I adjourn the meeting. During the corona pandemic, we have clearly seen that there's a lot of opposition to science coming from the right, but also from other parts of our society. And what I liked is that we heard today that the scientific arguments, the analysis, and the solutions for the problems are already at hand. When we speak about transition technologies, for example, we heard that there could be a yellow label, that nuclear power or gas would then not have to receive a green label. So I think that we showed here together that it's not like we're telling stories here. Because at the end of the day, the platform said, these are our recommendations, and they were ignored. So it's a difficult signal to say if the own consultants make good concrete proposals, and if then, for political reasons, these are ignored, then we do have a problem. And in times where we have more and more opposition to science, we have a particularly large issue. And that is why I hope that today's movement, that today's discussion will continue, that we will grow stronger, that we want science-based approaches to these questions. We have the solutions, and now these need to be introduced and implemented. 1.5 degrees is the goal that matters here, as the minister said, and I personally believe that it's extremely important that we progress towards achieving this goal. This was a slightly different Europe Calling to what we usually have. We at Europe Calling are very grateful for everyone that has decided to join us today. Thanks to everyone, thanks to the guests that have taken the time to prepare their speeches. I'd also like to thank the interpreters. Did a good job, so thank you very much to them. And I'd like to thank Campec, who financially supported us for the interpretation. That's of course useful because we're a small association, so we're very pleased that civil society decided to stick together here. I think in general this was an evening of cooperation, of hope, and thank you very much to all of you, and see you at the next Europe Calling webinar. Have a nice evening.